What if one of the most powerful military alliances ever created was never really built on trust? What if instead it was built on fear, timing, and a need to control a fragile system that could unravel at any moment? To understand that, we have to return to a Europe that had just survived one war and was quietly preparing for another kind. It is 1955. A decade has passed since World War II ended, yet the peace feels incomplete. Cities have been rebuilt, industries are running again, and governments are stabilizing, but the continent is divided in a way that feels permanent. On one side stands the United States and its allies, organized under NATO. On the other stands the Soviet Union, which has extended its influence deep into Eastern Europe. Countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, and East Germany are now part of a political and military sphere shaped by Moscow. These governments are formally independent, but their policies, security systems, and leadership structures are closely tied to Soviet priorities. For several years after the war, there is no formal military alliance on the Soviet side to match NATO. Instead, control is maintained through bilateral agreements, military presence, and political pressure. That changes in May 1955. Leaders from 8 countries gather in Warsaw. They sign what is officially called the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance. It becomes known simply as the Warsaw Pact. At first glance, it appears to mirror NATO. It promises collective defense. If one member is attacked, all will respond. It establishes a unified command structure. It signals strength and coordination. But almost immediately there is a difference that shapes everything that follows. In NATO, member states negotiate and maintain significant control over their own forces. In the Warsaw Pact, authority is concentrated. The supreme commander is always a Soviet officer. Strategic decisions flow from Moscow. This creates a system that looks like an alliance, but operates more like a hierarchy. The timing of its creation is not accidental. Just days before the treaty is signed, West Germany joins NATO. For the Soviet Union, this is a serious concern. Germany has been the central battlefield of the previous war, and its rearmament under a Western alliance raises fears of a future conflict. The Warsaw Pact is, in part, a response to that moment. It sends a message that Eastern Europe is organized, armed, and ready, but it also serves another purpose, one that becomes clearer over time. It creates a formal structure that binds Eastern European countries more tightly to the Soviet Union, not just militarily, but politically. The member states include the Soviet Union, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. On paper, they are equals. In practice, they are not. This becomes evident almost immediately. In 1956, Hungary becomes the first major test. Protests begin in Budapest, driven by economic hardship, political repression, and a desire to reform. What starts as a student movement quickly grows into a nationwide uprising. Demonstrators demand free elections, freedom of speech, and an end to Soviet influence. Then something even more significant happens. The Hungarian government announces that it intends to leave the Warsaw Pact. This is not just a protest. It is a direct challenge to the structure of the alliance. For a brief moment, it appears that a member state might actually break away. The response is decisive. Under the framework of the pact, Soviet forces move into Hungary. Tanks enter Budapest. Fighting breaks out. Within weeks, the uprising is suppressed. Hungarian Revolution of 1956 becomes a defining moment. It shows that the alliance will not allow defection, even if that defection comes from within. This is not a response to an external threat. It is an internal enforcement action. From this point on, the nature of the Warsaw Pact becomes clearer to both its members and the outside world. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, the alliance continues to develop. Military exercises become more frequent. Planning becomes more detailed. The possibility of a large-scale conflict with NATO remains central to its strategy. The Warsaw Pact prepares for scenarios that involve rapid movement of troops across Europe, coordination of air and ground forces, and even the potential use of nuclear weapons. In fact, nuclear strategy plays a significant role. The Soviet Union maintains control over nuclear weapons within the alliance, but planning assumes their use in the event of a major war. This adds another layer to the structure. It's not just about conventional defense. It's about positioning within the global balance of power where nuclear weapons define the stakes. At the same time, internal discipline remains a constant concern. In 1968, that concern becomes reality again. In Czechoslovakia, a new leadership begins to implement reforms. These changes aim to make the system more open, more flexible, and more responsive to public needs. Censorship is reduced. Political discussions become more active. Economic reforms are introduced. This period becomes known as the Prague Spring. For many citizens, it represents hope of a different kind of system, one that retains socialism but allows greater freedom. For the Soviet leadership, it represents risk. If these reforms succeed, they could inspire similar movements in other countries. The entire structure of the Eastern Bloc could begin to shift. In August 1968, troops from several Warsaw Pact countries, led by the Soviet Union, enter Czechoslovakia. The reforms are halted. Control is restored. This intervention leads to the articulation of what becomes known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. It states that the Soviet Union has the right to intervene in any socialist country to preserve the system. Once again, the alliance acts within its own borders. These events shape how the Warsaw Pact is understood. From one perspective, it is a defensive alliance responding to NATO. From another, it is a mechanism for maintaining a specific political order across Eastern Europe. Both interpretations exist at the same time. There are also differences within the alliance itself. Romania begins to pursue a more independent foreign policy. It participates in the pact, but often resists Soviet directives. Albania takes an even stronger stance, distancing itself from Moscow and eventually withdrawing from the alliance in the 1960s. These exceptions highlight that the Warsaw Pact is not completely uniform, but they also show how unusual independence is within the system. Meanwhile, the division of Europe becomes more visible. In Berlin, the Berlin Wall stands as a physical barrier between East and West. It's heavily guarded, difficult to cross, and symbolic of a broader separation that defines the Cold War. The Warsaw Pact exists on one side of that divide, NATO on the other. For decades, both alliances prepare for a conflict that never comes. There are moments of tension, moments of negotiation, and periods of reduced hostility, but the underlying structure remains. The Warsaw Pact continues to conduct large-scale exercises, refine its command systems, and maintain readiness. At the same time, there is an important detail that is often overlooked. Despite its image as a tightly coordinated military force, the Warsaw Pact does not achieve full operational integration immediately. In its early years, coordination is limited. National armies retain significant differences in equipment, training, and doctrine. It takes time for the alliance to develop the level of coordination it presents publicly. This suggests that part of its function is symbolic. It demonstrates unity even as that unity is still being built. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, new pressures begin to emerge. Economic challenges affect many Eastern European countries. Growth slows, living standards become a concern. Public dissatisfaction increases. At the same time, political changes begin with the Soviet Union itself. Reforms are introduced, control becomes less rigid, the environment begins to shift. These changes have a direct impact on the Warsaw Pact. If the central authority weakens, the entire structure becomes less stable. By 1989, events begin to move quickly. Across Eastern Europe, governments begin to change. In some cases, these changes are negotiated. In others, they come through public pressure. The system that had held the region together for decades begins to loosen. The most visible moment comes in Berlin. Crowds gather, barriers are opened. The fall of the Berlin Wall marks a turning point not just for Germany, but for the entire Cold War structure. With that, the foundation of the Warsaw Pact begins to disappear. Without aligned governments, without a shared political system, the alliance loses its purpose. In 1991, the Warsaw Pact is officially dissolved. Soon after, the Soviet Union itself comes to an end. Looking back, the Warsaw Pact cannot be understood in a single way. It is a military alliance, a political system, and a structure of control all at once. It reflects the realities of the Cold War, where security concerns and political priorities are closely connected. It also shows how alliances can function differently depending on how power is distributed within them. In one sense, it succeeds. It maintains a unified Eastern Bloc for decades. It presents a strong counterweight to NATO. It plays a central role in shaping the balance of power in Europe. In another sense, it reveals its limitations. Its reliance on centralized control makes it vulnerable to change. When that control weakens, the alliance cannot sustain itself. What remains is a deeper question. When nations come together under a shared agreement, what defines that agreement? Mutual interest or unequal power? The Warsaw Pact suggests that the answer is not always simple. Sometimes the structure of an alliance tells a different story than the words used to describe it, and sometimes that story only becomes clear when the system itself begins to change.